India, the fastest growing major economy in the world. It sounds incredible, right? But here's where things get interesting. You often hear India labeled as one of the slowest growing economies, too. So, how can both be true? That's the paradox we're unpacking in this deep dive. And trust me, it's a bit of a head scratcher. Our main source today is a blog post from Kuber, which is a website all about financial literacy in India. They really get into the nitty gritty of this complex situation. We're not just going to look at those shiny GDP numbers. We're going to see how this economic reality is playing out for everyday people in India. Because let's be honest, economics always boils down to people.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating here is that these economic paradoxes, they aren't just limited to India, they pop up all over the globe. So by understanding this specific situation, we're actually getting a glimpse into broader global trends, and that helps us become more informed citizens of the world.
Okay, so let's dive into the numbers right off the bat. The blog highlights this really impressive 8.2% GDP growth figure for India. On the surface, that screams success story.
It is significant growth, no doubt about it.
Yeah.
But here's the catch. It's unevenly distributed across different sectors of the economy. That's where the slowest growing part comes in. For instance, think about agriculture. Almost half of India's population, about 45%, work in agriculture. But this sector only grew by a tiny 1.4%.
Wow, 1.4% compared to 8.2%. That's a huge gap. So you're saying you have almost half the country working in a sector that's barely growing, while other industries are booming. What does that actually mean for people on the ground? Like,
Hmm,
if you compare the average farmer to someone working in, say, the booming tech sector in Bangalore, their realities must be worlds apart.
exactly. It's like they're living in two different economies.
Yeah.
You know, this isn't unique to India. Think about where you live. Have you noticed similar disparities where some jobs are growing rapidly while others are being left behind? The benefits of economic growth, unfortunately, don't always reach everyone equally.
And this ties into another point the blog brings up. Consumption in India only increased by 4%. If a huge chunk of the population isn't seeing any real benefits from this growth, they're not going to be out there spending more money right now.
Precisely. And now we get to the really concerning part. Let's talk about wages. You might assume that with such impressive GDP growth, wages would be increasing too. But in reality, real wages for many workers in India have actually gone down.
Wait, hold on. Declined? How is that even possible when the overall economy is growing so fast?
This is precisely what makes this situation such a paradox, and why just looking at GDP growth can be misleading. The ILO, the International Labor Organization, has a report that found average real earnings for regular salaried workers in India actually decreased by 1.2% each year between 2012 and 2022. That means their average earnings dropped from 12,100 to 10,925. Even the self-employed individual saw a decline of 0.8% annually.
So you're telling me that even if you have a steady job, you could actually be worse off now than you were a decade ago? That's a pretty alarming reality check.
Absolutely. And even for casual workers who did see a slight increase, it was only a modest 2.6% annually. That's hardly keeping pace with the rising cost of living, let alone reflecting the overall economic growth.
So we're seeing this clear disconnect between the impressive GDP numbers and the reality for many Indian workers now. The blog also digs into the growing gap between urban and rural areas in India, and they explain this concept called the wealth effect. It's like a positive feedback loop where rising asset values in cities, think real estate and stocks, lead to more spending by those who are already well off. But then you have the rural majority. And the article argues that government efforts to bridge this gap haven't been all that successful.
Right, and that wealth effect primarily benefits those who already have assets. If you look closer at rural India, the challenges become even more stark. The source specifically highlights stagnant or even declining wages in these areas, coupled with limited access to the benefits of new infrastructure projects like airports and highways.
It makes you think. All those shiny new airports and roads, if they're not actually improving the lives of the people in those rural areas, are they really making a difference? It's like building a fancy new bridge that no one can use.
Exactly. And this brings us to an important point. The source emphasizes the need for inclusive growth in India. In other words,
Hmm.
growth that benefits all segments of society, not just a select few.
And this disconnect has real-world consequences. The blog points out that rural voters in India are increasingly expressing their dissatisfaction with the status quo at the polls. These economic trends aren't just abstract numbers, they're having a tangible impact on people's lives and on the political landscape.
It really highlights the need to look beyond just GDP growth when we're evaluating a country's economic well-being.
Right, it's a classic case of a rising tide doesn't lift all boats. So if we're talking about this inclusive growth that the source mentions, what are some things India could be doing differently? Are there examples from other countries they could learn from?
That's a crucial question, and it's something economists and policymakers are grappling with right now. There's no magic bullet, no single solution that fits every situation. But there are a few key strategies that could really make a difference.
I'm all ears. What kind of strategies are we talking about?
One major area is investing in education and skills development, particularly in those rural areas we were just discussing. If you equip people with the tools and knowledge they need for higher paying jobs, you can start to close that income gap we've been talking about.
Makes sense. It's not just about creating jobs, it's about creating the right kinds of jobs. Jobs that can actually support families and lift people out of poverty.
Exactly. And this ties into another strategy, fostering rural entrepreneurship. Imagine if there were more support and resources available for people in rural areas to start their own businesses. That could create a ripple effect, boosting local economies and empowering individuals to become job creators, not just job seekers.
That's a powerful idea. Shifting from relying on big corporations to create jobs to empowering individuals to take charge of their own economic destinies.
Absolutely. And then there's the whole question of infrastructure. We talked about how those new airports and roads aren't always benefiting rural communities. So there needs to be a more targeted approach to infrastructure development. It's about connecting these rural areas to markets and opportunities, not just building impressive structures that look good in a photo op.
It's like that old saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. You can build all the fancy infrastructure you want, but if it doesn't actually reach the people who need it most, it's not going to make much of a difference.
A perfect analogy. And of course, government policies play a huge role. Things like agricultural subsidies, rural employment schemes, and access to affordable health care can all help level the playing field and create a more equitable economic landscape.
So it sounds like it's not about any one single solution, but a multifaceted approach. Investments in education, support for rural entrepreneurship, smarter infrastructure development, and effective government policies all working together.
Precisely. It's a complex challenge, no doubt.
Hmm.
But it's not an insurmountable one. And what's fascinating here is that these lessons aren't limited to India. These same dynamics are playing out in countries all over the world.
You're so right. Even in the United States, we see this massive gap between rural and urban communities, and a lot of the same issues around wage stagnation and income inequality that we're talking about with India.
Exactly. So by studying India's economic paradox, we're not just learning about one country. We're gaining insights into these broader global trends and starting to think about solutions that could potentially benefit people everywhere.
Okay, so we've laid out the challenges and explored some potential solutions, but let's zoom out a bit and think about the bigger picture. What does all this mean for the future of India's economy? Is it all doom and gloom, or is there reason for optimism?
I wouldn't say it's all doom and gloom. India has a lot going for it, a young and growing population, a dynamic democracy, and a vibrant spirit of entrepreneurship. But to truly unlock its potential, it needs to address these issues of inequality head-on. The benefits of growth need to be shared more widely.
So it sounds like India's at a crossroads. They can continue down this path of uneven growth where a select few benefit while many are left behind, or they can choose a more inclusive path, one that lifts up all segments of society, and the choices they make now will have huge implications for their future, not just economically, but socially and politically as well.
Precisely. And this is where it becomes really relevant for all of us, even if we don't live in India or have a direct stake in their economy. As our world becomes more interconnected, what happens in one country can have ripple effects across the globe. We're all in this together, so to speak.
So what's the main takeaway for our listener? What's the one thing you want them to remember from this deep dive?
The key takeaway here is that economic growth, while important, doesn't tell the whole story. We need to dig deeper, look beyond those headline numbers and ask, who is actually benefiting from this growth? Are those gains being shared equitably? And if not, what can we do as citizens and as a global community to create a more inclusive and just economic system?
Because at the end of the day, it's not just about GDP. It's about people's lives, about ensuring everyone has the opportunity to thrive and reach their full potential.
Absolutely. And that's a goal worth striving for no matter where we live in the world.
Well said. Now, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I keep coming back to this one question. If GDP growth alone isn't the best measure of a country's economic well-being, what should we be looking at instead? What are some alternative metrics that might paint a more complete picture, a more human-centered picture? It feels like we need to look beyond just the financial numbers. Things like income inequality, access to healthcare and education, environmental sustainability, those factors all play a huge role in people's quality of life.
You're absolutely right. Those are all crucial pieces of the puzzle. And there are lots of other metrics out there that try to capture this broader picture. For example, you have the Genuine Progress Indicator, the Human Development Index, and the Social Progress Index. These all attempt to measure a country's well-being by considering a much wider range of factors, not just economic output.
It's like we need a dashboard instead of just a speedometer. We need a way to measure not just how fast an economy is growing, but also in what direction and whether it's actually benefiting everyone on board.
I love that analogy. It perfectly captures the need for a more nuanced and holistic approach to evaluating economic progress.
So to our listener, we encourage you to explore these alternative metrics and really think critically about what truly defines a successful economy. Because in the end, it's not just about numbers, it's about people and their lived experiences.
Exactly. And as we navigate an increasingly complex and interconnected world, it's more important than ever to have these conversations and challenge the traditional ways of thinking about economic success.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into India's economic paradox. We hope you found it insightful and maybe even a little bit thought-provoking. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep